On Father's Day, my daughter's hand struck my face, not with the innocent playfulness of childhood, but with the cold sting of rejection. Her words cut deeper than the slap ever could. She called me nothing more than her mother's ex-husband, and worse, she called her new stepfather her real dad. 33 years of devotion, sacrifice, and love crumbled in that single moment. But one sentence from me, just a few quiet words, would later reduce her to tears and force her to beg for forgiveness. Before I tell you what happened, please subscribe to this channel, and in the comments, share the time it is where you are right now. The knife in my hand froze mid-slice when I first heard the tone in her voice. I had been chopping carrots for the evening soup, each rhythmic thunk against the cutting board, echoing through my quiet kitchen. Behind me, the pot simmered with chicken broth, releasing the comforting scent of thyme, garlic, and slow-cooked patience. My little sanctuary, warm, safe, familiar. And then the phone rang. Its sharp sound pierced the air like a blade, cutting straight through the fragile peace I'd managed to build. Agnes. My daughter's name on the screen made my chest tighten with something between dread and hope. I answered, forcing lightness into my tone. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice, flat, indifferent, slid through the receiver. "Hi, Dad. Look, I can come to this Father's Day thing of yours, but not for long." I set the knife down carefully, my hands trembling more than I wanted to admit. I wiped them on the towel at my waist, though no amount of drying could remove the sudden dampness of despair that had settled in. The steam from the pot, once inviting, now felt suffocating. "Of course, Agnes," I said, steadying myself. "I'd be happy to see you, even if it's just for a little while." "Right. Well, I'll probably drive over around noon on Sunday, but I can't stay past 3. I promised Mom and Eldon I'd help with their garden party." Her words hit harder than I expected. Their garden party. Not our Father's Day. Not the man who raised her, stayed up through her fevers, worked double shifts to buy her violin, who held her hand at her mother's funeral long before Eldon ever came into the picture. I stirred the soup absent-mindedly, watching the carrots and potatoes circle the broth. "That sounds lovely," I managed. "I was thinking of making that roast you used to love. Remember the one with the herb crust? Just don't cook that turkey from the 80s, okay?" She laughed, but it was hollow, humorless, the laugh of a stranger wearing my daughter's voice. A pang of memory pierced me. I had never cooked turkey on Father's Day. Not once. But correcting her would only build a wall higher than the one already between us. "Of course not," I murmured. "I'll make something special." "Good. And Dad, maybe try to keep things light, okay? I don't want to spend the whole time talking about your problems or whatever." My problems. As if missing my only daughter, longing for her presence, aching from her absence, was nothing more than a complaint. I closed my eyes, inhaled, and silently counted to 3, the trick my therapist taught me. "Absolutely," I said with practiced calm. "Just a nice, relaxing afternoon." "Great. Okay, I need to go. Eldon's calling me for dinner." The words sank into me like lead. "Eldon's calling me." She said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My ex-wife's new husband, the man who now sat at the head of her table, who laughed with her, who heard her stories that once belonged to me. "Give my regards to your mother," I forced out. The words tasted like ash. "Will do. See you Sunday, Dad." The line went dead before I could whisper the goodbye already forming on my lips. For a long time I stood there holding the silent phone, listening to the dial tone bleed into the bubbling of the soup. The carrots on the cutting board had dried at the edges, half chopped and abandoned like so much else in my life. I stared at them, the small, ordinary evidence of a life that no longer felt like my own. The soup still needed tending, but in that moment I felt as if something far more essential was slipping through my fingers, something I wasn't sure I could ever reclaim. I had dishes stacked in the sink, bills scattered on the kitchen table, and a dozen small tasks waiting for me, the kind of little chores that usually kept my evenings occupied. But for a long moment I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the floor, my hand still clutching that silent phone, as though it could explain itself if I just held on long enough. In the reflection of the dark kitchen window, I saw my own face lined, weary, hollowed out by something deeper than age. 3 hours. That was all my daughter had to give me. 3 hours out of an entire year, after everything we had shared, after everything we had been to one another. Finally, I set the phone down with a carefulness that felt absurd as if the fragile weight of disappointment might shatter the device. I turned back to the cutting board. The knife lay where I'd left it, glinting under the light, but when I picked it up, it felt strange in my grip, too heavy, unfamiliar. Still, I kept chopping, each slice neat and exact, guided by the muscle memory of 4 decades in engineering. Precision was second nature to me. Precision gave me control even now when so much else was out of my hands. The soup would be ready in 20 minutes. I would eat it alone, like always staring at the same 4 walls while trying to plan a meal for a daughter who already couldn't wait to leave. The thought hollowed me out. I let the spoon fall into the pot, abandoned the simmering broth. The vegetables could burn for all I cared. What did it matter? Her voice still lingered in the room, sharp and careless, each word cutting deeper than if she had shouted. Indifference has a way of hurting more than hatred ever could. Without quite knowing why, I found myself wandering into the living room, pulled by a force I couldn't name. My eyes fell on the bottom shelf of the bookcase where the photo albums rested in a neat, accusing row. I reached down my hand, brushing over the leather spine of the oldest one, my fingertips tracing the worn edges before I pulled it free. Dust motes rose in the lamplight, swirling like tiny ghosts as I sank into my chair. 5 years ago, everything changed. The words echoed in my head as familiar as a prayer. I'd recited them often enough to therapists, to the empty rooms of this house, even to myself in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come. I'd said them so many times the syllables had lost their meaning, worn smooth like pebbles in a river. But tonight they felt sharp again, fresh, wounding. I opened the album to a page from 2019, our last real Christmas together. Lula wore the red sweater I had bought her. Agnes had her arm looped around my shoulder, her smile wide and genuine. We all looked happy, unshaken whole. Before Eldon, before the firm downsized me into irrelevance, before the threads of my life began to unravel one by one, until all that remained was this cold house and the silence inside it. The divorce papers were in the next room, tucked neatly in a drawer with all the other legal reminders of endings. I didn't need to look at them to see them clearly: yellowed legal paper, a faint ring of coffee stains from that morning in the lawyer's office, when even my hands shook. My signature sprawled confidently across the bottom, a cruel irony, my life unraveling, even as my pen pretended certainty. 60 years old when they let me go. Too old to be considered useful, too young to quit fighting. The severance lasted 8 months, 8 hollow months of sending out resumes that disappeared into the digital void. 8 months of hope shriveling like autumn leaves while Lula's patience withered alongside it. She began staying out later. Book club meetings that ended past midnight, whispered phone calls in the other room, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard in decades, lighter, girlish, alive. When she finally said his name, Eldon, I didn't feel rage, just emptiness. He makes me feel like myself again, she told me, as if 32 years of marriage had erased her identity rather than shaped it. As if the man who had worked double shifts to put her through graduate school, who celebrated every single promotion, who clapped the loudest at every victory, had somehow held her back instead of lifting her up. But potential was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Not after losing the job, not after watching my life hollow out from the inside. I flipped through more pages of the album, each photograph a knife wrapped in paper. Agnes, at 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning proudly beside the treehouse I built with my own hands. Agnes, at 16, rolling her eyes at my jokes but laughing despite herself. Agnes, at 25, calling me in a rush of excitement about her first real job, her voice bright with trust and love. When had that trust begun to rust? I searched the photos for clues, but of course they couldn't answer. It hadn't been sudden. No, it crept in slowly, the way corrosion eats through metal, invisible at first, then unstoppable. Phone calls that once lasted hours dwindled to minutes. Visits turned into obligations, another box to check, before she went back to the life she shared with her mother and Eldon. She stopped asking for my advice. She stopped needing me. And now all I had left was 3 hours. 3 hours on Father's Day, parceled out like spare change. The successful businessman who had so effortlessly stepped into the vacuum, left by my unemployment, seemed to take more than just my wife's affection. He'd gradually claim my daughter's loyalty too. Stability, confidence, the promise of a future, without question, marks all the things I could no longer offer. They were his currency. And Agnes, my Agnes, had leaned toward that certainty the way a plant bends toward the sun. From the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgled a familiar, almost comforting sound I had programmed into my evenings long ago. For years, that soft rhythm had been the backdrop to my life, making coffee while bills stacked up, while job applications disappeared into silence while my marriage quietly unraveled. It kept brewing faithfully even as I lost everything else. I pulled out another album from the shelf. This one was from Agnes's college years. The glossy graduation photo nearly stopped my breath. There she was, beaming her cap, tilted slightly askew, my arm wrapped tightly around her waist. Lula stood on the other side, her hand holding Agnes's. We looked like a team, then the three of us, a family unit, unshakable, unbreakable. I remembered that day as if it were yesterday, the sun hot overhead, my heart swelling with pride so fierce, I thought it might split me open. 2 years later, Lula remarried. 6 months after that, Agnes started casually calling Eldon her bonus dad. The phrase alone made my stomach twist every time I heard it, as if fathers were like spare parts you could replace when the original broke down, as if decades of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and late-night talks could be swapped out for a newer model. Eventually, I pulled open the drawer in my desk and retrieved the legal documents. They felt heavier than paper should ever feel. Custody arrangements, not for a child, but for an adult daughter, as if love could be divided neatly on a spreadsheet. Property divisions that left me with half of nothing. Alimony calculations that assumed I'd bounce back into another six-figure engineering job, as if companies were waiting in line to hire men of 60. I never did. The house creaked around me in its familiar language, the groan of old beams, the sigh of settling wood, a symphony of solitude for a man left behind. I carried the photo albums to the coffee table and spread the pictures out like tarot cards, trying to divine my future, from faces that once looked at me with absolute unquestioning love. One photograph made me stop. Agnes, at 7 years old, chocolate ice cream smeared across her cheek like battle paint, her small hand gripping mine as we stood in front of the zoo's elephant enclosure. I remembered that day in perfect detail, the way her gasp of wonder filled the air when the baby elephant trumpeted, the way she insisted on riding my shoulders all the way back to the car. Her little arms wrapped around my neck, she'd whispered, "You're my superhero, Daddy. You're the strongest man in the whole world. The strongest man." I almost laughed at the bitter irony. By 12, she was already defending me to classmates who teased her about my dented ancient Honda. My dad's car's vintage, she had declared with pride, chin jutting out like a warrior. It's got character. That fierce loyalty, that spark, it was mine. She'd inherited my stubborn streak, the refusal to back down when something mattered. High school came, and with it, boy troubles, college applications, dreams that stretched further than she realized she could reach. And every time she came to me, my workshop became her confessional. She'd perch on the edge of my workbench while I sanded wood or adjusted some half-finished project, and she'd lay out her plans like blueprints. "You always believe in me, Dad," she told me once, her voice soft but certain, "even when I don't believe in myself." I set the zoo picture down, my fingers trembling, and wandered through the house as if searching for proof that those moments had really happened. The kitchen table where she scribbled homework while I cooked. The corner of the living room where she tortured us with her violin's squeaky scales, giving way slowly, painfully to something beautiful. In my closet, I found the old shoebox filled with Father's Day cards she'd made me as a little girl. Construction paper hearts, uneven block letters, and crayon declarations that I was the best dad ever. I held them one by one as if they could tether me to the man I used to be, the man she once believed I was. And then I returned to the photograph of my daughter, 7 years old, chocolate-stained eyes shining with unshakable trust. 3 hours on Sundays. That's all I had now. But even 3 hours were something. I would take what I could get. Each of those old cards had been signed with the kind of flourish only a child could create, looping letters that nearly spilled off the page, as if her 7-year-old self believed her name carried the weight of a royal decree. To her, it had. Back then, every scribble, every doodled heart was proof of a bond unshakable. She used to call me her hero, her unbreakable shield against the world. But now, what happened to that little girl? The answer wasn't buried in the past. It was alive in the sharper, fresher memories that pressed against me whenever I tried too hard to look away. Agnes at 28, her brow furrowed, comparing something I'd advised with Eldon's words and finding mine lacking. Agnes at 30, asking me for help with her down payment, careful to mention in the same breath that Eldon had already covered most of it. Agnes at 32, the moment that still felt like a dagger in my chest, the first time she said without hesitation that Eldon felt more like a real father. That sentence hadn't just hurt, it had hollowed me out. I had raised her from the time she was 2, after Lula, and I had signed the papers that made her ours forever. I was the one who steadied the bike when she wobbled, who clapped louder than anyone at school plays, who slept in uncomfortable chairs at her bedside when fever spiked or nightmares chased her from her bed. I was the one who weathered the storms of teenage heartbreak, who always showed up no matter what. And yet in the space of a few short years, a man with the right wallet, the right connections, the right air of effortless confidence had managed to buy his way into a role I had spent decades building. Somehow money and polished manners had outweighed years of love, sacrifice, and devotion. From the kitchen the timer chimed, reminding me of the soup I'd left simmering. I ignored it. Let it burn. What did it matter now when everything else I'd believed permanent was already scorched beyond recognition? Eldon had advantages I could never compete with: funds for vacations that became Instagram-worthy adventures, access to people who could open doors for Agnes' career, the kind of steady assurance that comes when you've never once wondered where your next paycheck might come from. When Agnes earned her MBA, he threw her a lavish party at his country club. When she was promoted, he toasted her at restaurants I could barely pronounce, let alone afford to step inside. And me, I had given her the only things I knew how to give: homemade meals at our worn kitchen table, long walks where she could spill her worries into the night air. The kind of love that doesn't photograph well, that can't be wrapped up in shiny packaging or posted online for likes and comments. A steady presence, a father who stayed. But in a world dazzled by spectacle, steady presence doesn't shine. After I lost my job, the change only quickened. Phone calls grew shorter, visits briefer. Holidays became an obligation she ticked off her list before darting away to more exciting plans. I was the warm-up act, never the main event, and now here I was clinging to Sunday like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Planning the menu with desperate precision as if garlic mashed potatoes and green bean casserole could carry the weight of 33 years of fatherhood. I pulled out the chocolate chip cookie recipe she used to love helping me with, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the smell of melted chocolate and sugar would remind her of afternoons when flour dusted her cheeks and she laughed without restraint. I set the dining table with the good china Lula had left behind. 2 places side by side, an act of hope or foolishness. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. 3 hours. That's all I'd get. 3 hours to compress decades of love, sacrifice, and memory into something that might stick. The grandfather clock struck 10:30, as chime echoing through the quiet house like a reminder of everything slipping away. I knew I should rest, but sleep would not come easily tonight. With the zoo picture still clutched in my hand, I turned off the lamp and climbed the stairs, each creak beneath my feet louder than it should have been. At the end of the hall, Agnes's room waited, untouched, preserved exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago. Sometimes I lingered at that doorway, letting my eyes roam over the posters still taped to the walls, the faded trophies lined on the shelves, the unmade bed that once held the shape of a girl who still called me Dad with reverence. I would stand there and try to remember the weight of those days when coming home meant coming back to me. Now it all came down to 3 hours. 3 hours to prove I still mattered. 3 hours to stand against the tide of slow erosion and remind my daughter of who I had been and who I still was. 3 hours. And God help me, I intended to make every second count. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step reminding me of the years pressing down on my knees. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath alongside me. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would shop for the ingredients she liked best, scrub every corner of this old place until it shone and set the table like it still mattered. I would prepare for my daughter's brief return to the life she had long since outgrown. But tonight, all I had was her picture clutched in my hand, the frame smudged with my fingerprints, and the endless question echoing in my mind: was love enough when everything else had failed? The next afternoon found me in my back garden, buried elbow deep in soil, waging war against weeds that didn't deserve such fury. My hands worked faster than my thoughts, but the truth was, I was only trying to outrun them. Thursday's phone call still circled like a vulture in my mind. 3 hours, she had said, like she was offering me a rare gift instead of time with her father. 3 hours ration, like precious medicine. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. At least she was coming. The sudden slam of a car door froze me, mid-pull, my fist locked around a stubborn dandelion. Deliveries always came to the front. Visitors were rare. I straightened dirt clinging to my palms, and through the gap in the fence, I caught the gleam of silver metallic paint. My heart lurched. Agnes's Audi. She was here. Unexpected, early, unannounced. My pulse kicked hard against my ribs as I dropped the trowel, wiping my hands on the rag, tucked into my pocket, trying to make myself presentable in 2 seconds flat. She never came early. She never came without warning. Rounding the corner of the house, I saw her already striding up the cracked concrete walk with that purposeful gait I used to admire when she was a teenager, rushing toward her dreams. Her portfolio case swung at her side, and her sharp navy blazer caught the sunlight like armor. Each click of her heels on the worn path sounded like a verdict. "Dad," she said, pausing at the step. Her eyes flicked over me, my grass-stained knees, my soil-caked fingernails, as if cataloging the gulf between us in one quick glance. "We need to talk." "Seriously?" "Of course, sweetheart," I answered too quickly, fumbling for my keys. My tongue felt clumsy in my mouth, my throat dry. Suddenly, the peeling paint on the front door, the rusty hinge that creaked whenever it opened, seemed unbearable against her polished presence. I wanted the house to look like it had once when Pride had lived here. "Come in, please." She stepped into the living room with the assurance of someone who belonged everywhere she went. I trailed behind, awkward in my own home. She settled on the couch, opened her portfolio, and in seconds my coffee table was covered in charts, graphs, neat columns of numbers. It looked less like my living room now and more like a boardroom. Her eyes lit up with a spark I hadn't seen in years, and for a moment I glimpsed the girl she once was, the girl who would thrust her school projects into my lap, bubbling with ideas. "I've been developing something incredible, Dad," she began, her voice brimming with conviction. "A digital marketing consultancy for small businesses?" She tapped one of the charts with a manicured finger. "The market is completely underserved. Mom and pop shops, family-run restaurants, neighborhood services, they're all struggling to survive online. I can help them." I leaned forward despite myself, caught between pride and confusion. That sounds promising. You always had an eye for opportunity." Her smile widened, fierce with ambition. "Exactly. I've already lined up 3 potential clients just from conversations. And look here." She flipped to another page. "Conservative projections put me at 6 figures within 18 months. This is only the beginning." The numbers swam before my eyes: recurring revenue, acquisition costs, margins, forecasts. It was the language of a world that had long since left me behind. But her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt my lips tremble into a smile. "This is impressive, Agnes. Really impressive." I traced a rising line on the page with my finger, my pride swelling against the ache in my chest. "But what does this have to do with I need $100,000 for my startup?" The words cut through me sharper than any blade. My coffee cup rattled in my hand, dark liquids sloshing dangerously near the rim. 100,000. I set it down carefully, afraid my trembling would betray me. My voice cracked. "That's a significant investment." She was already nodding, already prepared. More documents slid across the table. Office lease agreements, equipment quotes, initial marketing budgets, incorporation fees, every detail calculated down to the cent. I stared at the pages, my silence thickening the air. The numbers grew larger the longer I looked at them, expanding until they seemed to fill the entire room, pressing me into the couch cushions. "Dad," she said gently, almost impatiently. "I know it sounds like a lot, but this opportunity won't wait." Her words hung between us, heavy and final. And for the first time in a long while, I realized this conversation wasn't about me or even us. It was about her future and whether there was still a place for me in it. She leaned forward, her eyes alight with conviction, her voice carrying a sharp urgency that pressed hard against my chest. "Dad, there's another firm sniffing around this exact market segment. If I don't move now, if I don't secure these clients first, I'll lose them forever. Timing is everything." Her words tumbled out with the force of inevitability. I swallowed, forcing myself to ask the practical questions that a father was supposed to ask, though my mind was already spiraling. Have you approached banks? Looked into business loans? Anything?" She exhaled in a small huff, waving her hand dismissively as if the very suggestion was naive. Banks. You know how they are, Dad. They want years of established revenue, perfect credit histories, collateral I don't have. They'd rather back safe bets than vision. But family, her gaze softened briefly, though her tone remained firm. Family is different. Family invests in potential, not just spreadsheets. Family investment. The phrase landed in my gut like a stone, as if I were one of the Rockefellers sitting on a vast fortune instead of a retired engineer nursing a modest pension and a savings account I'd guarded like a fragile egg. She straightened her voice, quickening again, her hands gesturing with practiced confidence. I've run every scenario. Break even by month 14, full profitability by month 20. These aren't fantasies, Dad. They're grounded in solid market research. I've studied the competition. I know exactly where the gaps are and how to fill them. This is real. This is my future. Her enthusiasm filled the room until it felt suffocating. Charts and projections lay scattered across my coffee table, neon-colored arrows pointing to limitless growth. She spoke of client acquisition strategies, targeted advertising campaigns, digital pipelines, things I only half understood but could hear were meticulously prepared. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. I murmured encouragement, the kind a father gives out of instinct, but inside my brain was furiously calculating. $100,000. That was the number echoing louder than her voice. My entire life savings barely reached $25,000. Even if I liquidated what little remained, sold possessions, cashed out emergency bonds, maybe I could scrape together $40,000. But $100,000, that was a mountain I had no gear to climb. She finally stopped her presentation, winding down, and leaned back with the confidence of someone who believed victory was already secured. So what do you think? She asked, eyes bright with anticipation, her whole body leaning into the silence between us. I looked at her, really looked. At the excitement shimmering in her face, the careful notes she'd prepared, the way she still, after everything, trusted me to be the one who could help her dream take flight. The weight of that expectation pressed against my ribs until I thought they might crack. I'll try to figure something out, sweetheart, I whispered, my throat dry. Her smile in that instant could have lit my entire house. I knew you would. You always come through. She began gathering her materials with the brisk efficiency of someone already moving on to the next step of her plan. I'll need to know by Sunday, though. Monday at the latest. The office space won't stay available long. Sunday, Father's Day. The irony stung like salt in an open wound. I understand, I said softly. Time-sensitive opportunities require quick decisions. I helped her stack her papers, my hands moving automatically, my mind still scrambling for solutions that didn't exist. She smoothed her blazer, stood and gave me a final grateful smile. Thanks, Dad. This means everything. Finally, I'll be able to prove what I'm capable of. I walked her to the door, watched her confident stride back toward her silver Audi. At the driver's side, she paused, turned, and waved with radiant certainty that I would move heaven and earth to make this impossible dream possible. Then she was gone, the car disappearing around the corner, leaving me standing in my doorway, clutching her business plan in my dirt-stained hands. The afternoon sun was too bright. The suburban silence pressed in, unbearably complete. $100,000. I'd promised her the moon when I could barely afford a box of candles. The folder of charts and projections seemed heavier with each step as I walked back inside. I passed by family photos framed along the hallway wall. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, all smiling faces captured in better times. Tonight they mocked me, those frozen moments of a father who used to seem unshakable, who could always provide. My office was really just the smallest bedroom converted years ago after the divorce, when I downsized into this house I could barely afford. I dropped into the creaking chair at my wooden desk, spreading Agnes's documents beside my outdated computer. It wheezed to life as though resenting the effort. I pulled my reading glasses from the drawer and opened the filing cabinet labeled banking. Inside, my life was reduced to manila folders and balances carefully tracked. Numbers that suddenly seemed insultingly small. $25,000, that was all. And somehow my daughter was asking me for 4 times more. That was everything I had. The number had been circling my mind ever since Agnes closed the door behind her. but seeing it now fixed in cold black and white made my stomach knot until it ached. 5 years. 5 years of rebuilding after the divorce. 5 years of swallowing pride, of disciplined saving, of telling myself that security meant dignity. Every small denial was etched in this sum: the restaurant meals I never ate, the vacations I never booked, the clothes I never bought. Each sacrifice stacked carefully into a modest shield against the world. My checking account told a predictable story: $3.47. Just enough for the bills, the groceries, the gas, calculated to the decimal, to last until the next pension deposit. My savings account held $18,500. That number had once felt like an achievement, my quiet fortress against the unexpected. And in the small fireproof safe behind my desk, folded into neat envelopes, was $300 in cash, my just-in-case fund for days when the banks might fail, or I simply needed to know that paper bills were within arm's reach. Together it made $24,997. Call it $25,000. 75,000 short. I clicked through tabs, dragging the internet to load the one account I never wanted to touch. My retirement fund, $127,000, glared back at me, both a comfort and a curse. I might as well have been staring through glass at a treasure buried on the moon. To reach it would mean brutal penalties, taxes, bureaucratic questions about hardship. To reach it would mean surrendering the one cushion left between me and destitution. My old calculator sat beneath my palm, the same one I'd used decades ago for engineering designs. Its familiar plastic buttons clicked softly as I tried to force the math into obedience. Numbers crunched, sums shifted, but the conclusion remained merciless. Even if I stripped myself bare, I could not give my daughter what she asked for. Home equity, maybe $85,000, though selling would take months and leave me with no roof over my head. My Honda, perhaps $8,000 on trade, if I was lucky. The furniture Lula left behind after the divorce might fetch a few thousand at an estate sale, though the thought of strangers pawing through those remnants twisted my gut. Even then, not enough. Never enough. Each account, each balance, each line of cold digits was a verdict delivered in slow motion. My internet crawled every page, refresh another swing of the judge's gavel. The verdict was always the same. $100, $1,000 was an empire far beyond my reach. The sunlight tilted across my office, catching the dust that hovered like tiny witnesses above the paper stacks. Once I'd felt pride here. Pride in clawing back to stability and turning nothing into $25,000, a fragile but respectable cushion for a man who had lost almost everything. I remembered opening that savings account 5 years ago, the teller's polite smile, her words of encouragement. "It's a fresh start, Mr. Anderson. You'll build it up." And I had. I deposited every dollar like planting seeds in barren soil. $200 here, $500 there. Sometimes birthday money from distant relatives, sometimes scraps of consulting income. Watching the balance climb from zero had felt like watching my life crawl out of ruins. Agnes used to see the value in smaller things. I remembered the pride in her voice when I handed her $5,000 for her first car's down payment. I remembered her tearful hug when I scraped together $3,000 for her security deposit on that first apartment. Even $1,000 once seemed like a miracle to her. Back then I was the safety net, the steady hand, the father who could always find a way. But that was before Eldon, before she saw what real money could buy, what scale true wealth could reach. My gestures had shrunk in her eyes until they were tokens, well-meaning but small. I picked up the landline, my thumb hesitating over the keypad. Who would I even call? My contact list was thinner than my savings. Colleagues from the old days had scattered to other states, other jobs, other lives. Neighbors were strangers whose names I couldn't recall. Family, most of them, were hanging on by their own thin margins. Behind me, the safe waited, not just with cash, but with the fragile paper backbone of my life, the house deed, my insurance policies, my father's will. Proof that I owned something, still proof that I hadn't been entirely erased by divorce, by age, by time. Yet even combined, all these scraps could not be stacked high enough to bridge the gulf between my daughter's glittering vision and my hard gray reality. I sat there, the silence of the house pressing in. A father's love had carried me through storms before, but now love alone would not pay $100,000. My coffee from the morning sat untouched and cold beside the keyboard, a thin brown ring staining the wood where the mug had sweated through the hours. The smell had gone bitter metallic, almost like failure in liquid form. Above me, the wall clock ticked steadily toward 5 o'clock each second, snapping against my nerves like a metronome, counting down to Judgment Day. Sunday's deadline loomed just beyond the horizon, an invisible weight pressing harder with every tick. I pushed back from the desk glasses, slipping down my nose as I rubbed my eyes with the heels of my hands. The numbers on the computer screen blurred together, but no amount of squinting or blinking could soften the brutal math. 25,000 available immediately. Maybe if I liquidated what little I had sold, my car cashed out a portion of retirement, with penalties another 10, maybe 15, at best. Still impossibly short. But I'd promised Agnes I'd figure something out. She had driven away from my house, full of faith in me, her voice buoyed with certainty, her smile lighting up her face, as though miracles were nothing more than everyday tasks for fathers like me. She believed in me the way children are supposed to believe in their fathers, that we can fix anything, shoulder anything, make the impossible possible. Once I had managed that. But those problems had been smaller than a few thousand for a car down payment, a month's rent tuition help. Now the numbers towered over me like some cruel monument to how far I'd fallen. I picked up my pen and dragged it across a yellow legal pad, writing out the figures in bold strokes as though seeing them in my own hand might unlock some secret solution. $100,000 needed, $25,000 available, a $75,000 gap. The word gap looked obscene on paper, like a canyon carved straight through my future. I stared at it until the ink seemed to bleed. Saturday morning arrived with no answers, only the heavy stillness of a house too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee cooling beside a growing stack of papers, account statements, contact lists, calculations scrawled in margins. Sleep had abandoned me the night before. I'd risen before dawn, too restless to lie, still too desperate to keep waiting. Today would be the day I tried. Tried everyone, tried everything. By 9 o'clock, I found myself walking into First National Bank, the place where I'd deposited every careful dollar over the last 5 years. My documents were tucked under my arm like armor, though I knew they were flimsy shields against the rejection I felt coming. The loan officer was young, maybe Agnes's age, her polite professionalism betraying just enough skepticism to sting. Unfortunately, Mr. Cruz, she said, sliding my credit report across the desk with manicured fingers. Your rating is adequate, but not exceptional. Without steady employment, income unsecured loans of this size are extremely difficult to approve. I'd known it. God help me, I had known it before I walked in, but hearing it confirmed out loud felt like being struck in the chest. What about a home equity line of credit, I asked, clinging to the thread of possibility. That's possible, she admitted, but the application process takes 4 to 6 weeks. Even expedited processing requires 3 weeks minimum. We'd need a current appraisal, income verification, debt-to-income calculations. 3 weeks. Agnes needed an answer by Sunday. Her dream was evaporating in front of me, and I could do nothing to stop it. By 11, I was driving across town to meet Jerry, my old colleague from the engineering firm, where we'd sweated side by side for 15 years. Downsizing had scattered us, but if anyone remembered what I was capable of, it was him. The coffee shop he'd chosen was nearly empty, its vinyl booths cracked with age, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like tired bees. Winfred, he said after I explained his spoon-stirring coffee that had long since cooled. I'd help if I could, but things are tight everywhere. Sarah's medical bills last year, they wiped us out. He hesitated, eyes downcast. I might be able to scrape together 2, maybe 3,000. 2,000. A teaspoon against an ocean. I reached across and gripped his hand, thanked him with every ounce of sincerity I could muster. But when I walked back to my car, the number echoed in my head, hollow and pitiful. The drive to Mike's house took 40 minutes through neighborhoods that looked too much like my own modest homes, belonging to modest families making modest livings. Mike had been my college roommate, the best man at my wedding. If anyone would understand, it was him. His living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, comfortable but unpretentious. Photos of grandchildren I'd never met lined the mantel. Time had built a new life for him, one I'd fallen out of somewhere along the way. 5,000, Mike said after I'd explained. That's what I can realistically manage, but I'd need 2 weeks to free up the money without losing my shirt. 2 weeks. Another impossible timeline in a day already littered with impossibilities. I wish I could do more, Winfred, he said softly, regret heavy in his voice. That's a hell of a lot of money to raise in quickly. I smiled the kind of smile meant to reassure others when the only one who needed reassuring was me. Outside, the sun was already beginning to dip long shadows stretching across driveways and lawns. Every door I knocked on, every call I made returned the same truth: I could not conjure $75,000 out of thin air. And yet come Sunday, Agnes would be looking at me with those bright, expectant eyes, the eyes of a daughter who still believed her father could deliver the impossible. He walked me to his car. His brow furrowed, his head shaking gently, as if he carried the weight of disappointment for both of us. Winfred, he said carefully, have you considered that maybe she should start smaller? Work her way up to something that ambitious? His words were kind, but they cut deep. Start smaller. Work her way up. It was sensible advice, practical, grounded in the kind of slow, patient building I'd lived by all my life. But Agnes wasn't thinking small. She wasn't built for careful increments anymore. Eldon had taught her to think big, bigger than I'd ever dared. Big dreams, aggressive timelines, goals measured in 6 figures. Not the steady crawl of hundreds and thousands. I drove aimlessly until I found myself parked outside a corner. I'd passed 1,000 times but never truly noticed. An antique shop. Its windows were cluttered with mismatched furniture, faded lampshades, and clocks that had long ago given up on keeping time. I stepped inside and the air smelled of dust and forgotten stories, other people's treasures abandoned for pennies. The owner, a frail man with wire-rimmed glasses, regarded Lula's jewelry box as though it were no more precious than a chipped vase. The pearls are cultured, not natural, he said flatly, setting them aside. Maybe 400. My stomach dropped. 400. I had imagined thousands. Hope shriveled quietly inside me as he picked up my father's old watch collection. These Timexes from the 70s. Maybe 600 if the mechanisms still work. I swallowed hard. My father's watches, keepsakes of a man who'd taught me responsibility, who'd measured his days with the same tick and tock that now mocked me from the display case. They were worth hundreds, not thousands. The wedding china, however, drew more interest. The owner held up a plate, its floral edges catching the dim light. Nearly 2,000 if sold as a complete service for 12. 2,000, the highest number yet. But as I cradled those plates in my hands, I didn't see money, I saw Lula. I saw her arranging the table for our very first Thanksgiving as husband and wife, the nervous excitement in her eyes, the way she smoothed the tablecloth 3 times before guests arrived. How could I sell that memory for cash? Some prices were simply too high to pay. He tallied everything, his voice detached, rehearsed. Maybe 5,000 total if you're patient and wait for the right buyers. But if you need quick cash, he glanced around the crowded shop, then lowered his tone. Immediate sale value would be closer to 3. 3? The number echoed in my chest like a hollow drum. I drove home as the evening light painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. My calculator sat on the passenger seat, and with trembling hands I added and re-added the numbers as though persistence might change reality. Jerry's possible 2,000. Mike's 5,000, but only in 2 weeks. The antique sales, maybe 5 at best. Even with the most generous outcomes, I was still staring at a gaping canyon. 40,000 short. By the time I turned into my driveway, the asphalt beneath my tires felt like the end of a long, useless road. My driveway had never looked so much like a dead end. I sat in the car for several minutes, unable to move, clutching the calculator like it might suddenly produce a miracle. Personal savings, 25,000. Possible loans from friends, 7. Antique sales, 5. Maximum possible total, 37,000. Still 63,000 short. No matter how many times I pressed the buttons, no matter how many scenarios I ran, the result was the same impossibility. As I stepped out, my house seemed to shrink smaller with each step I took toward the door, as if even it knew how little I truly had to offer. Inside, the business plan waited on my coffee table where Agnes had left it. Charts, projections, and numbers full of her confidence that her father could make miracles happen. But miracles, I was learning, required resources I'd never possessed. That night stretched into eternity, each hour filled with rehearsals of the conversation I dreaded most. How do you tell your child you failed them, that the man they believed could fix anything couldn't fix this? By dawn, I had resolved on one last act of dignity, a simple Father's Day lunch. The turkey carved carefully, the table set with my best china, the same set I couldn't bear to sell. Everything arranged perfectly, not to celebrate, but to soften the blow. When Agnes came through that door, she would see a father trying, a father who had built as much as he could, only to be crushed by numbers that refused to bend. And still I prayed she might see something more, not the failure in my empty hands, but the love in everything I had sacrificed to fill them. When the doorbell chimed exactly at noon, it startled me more than it should have. I'd been standing in the kitchen, hands damp with turkey juices, rehearsing the words I dreaded saying. The towel I used to dry my palms trembled slightly between my fingers. I had planned this moment down to the minute, 3 uninterrupted hours with Agnes, just the two of us, enough time to explain everything carefully, gently, without her feeling betrayed. I thought I'd at least have the dignity of honesty on Father's Day. But when I opened the door, the script I'd practiced all night long disintegrated into dust. 3 silhouettes filled the doorway. At the center, Agnes radiant, smiling, her excitement nearly glowing. But on either side of her, like unwelcome punctuation, stood Lula and Eldon. My ex-wife and the man who had taken everything I once held sacred, my marriage, my role, and it seemed even my daughter's admiration. For a moment, the world tilted. My hand clutched the door frame, the wood suddenly, the only solid thing keeping me upright. "Surprise, Dad," Agnes said, her voice bright as sunlight cutting through a storm. "I brought Mom and Eldon." The words struck like a bucket of ice water. My breath caught. I stumbled back half a step, my perfect day collapsing into something unrecognizable, like a nightmare written over my careful plans. "Hi, Winfred." Lula's voice came next, soft, cautious, wrapped in an uncomfortable cheer that didn't fool anyone. She didn't meet my eyes, her gaze flicking instead to the floor, the walls, anywhere but me. And then Eldon. He didn't even wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, broad-shouldered, confident, his presence filling my small porch like a storm cloud. His eyes moved across my home, calculating, cataloging. "Interesting little place," he said, his tone polite, but edged the kind of word you'd use to describe something quaint, not respectable. "Very cozy." Cozy, a word for cottages in children's storybooks. Not for the home a man had built from decades of labor, sacrifice, and quiet survival. "Of course not," I heard myself saying automatically, the reflex of old manners, overriding every instinct screaming inside me. "Please come in." And just like that, they swept past me, claiming space that suddenly felt too small, too fragile. My living room, which had seemed warm and adequate an hour ago, shrank beneath their presence. Eldon didn't just sit. He occupied, lowering himself into my armchair with the ease of someone already rehearsing ownership. His fingers drifted over my books, my picture frames, as though measuring their worth, as though testing whether my life could be rearranged to his liking. Lula perched on the sofa, posture stiff, her purse held like a shield against invisible crossfire. She attempted a smile in Agnes's direction. "Your father's made this place very nice. Very, comfortable." Another careful adjective, smaller than praise, safer than truth. Comfortable. The word tasted like resignation. Agnes, oblivious to the storm brewing between us, twirled in the center of the room, her arms stretched out wide, her voice ringing with innocent joy. "Isn't this perfect, all my family together for Father's Day? All her family, not my family, not anymore." Her words cut deeper than she could have known. "I thought this would be good for everyone," she continued, smiling between us. "You know, family bonding, getting to know each other better. Getting to know each other. As if Eldon and I were strangers on neutral ground. As if we hadn't already fought silent wars over love, respect, and legacy." My chest tightened. I forced my body into motion, retreating toward the kitchen before the weight of it all dragged me down. My thoughts raced. The turkey was there enough to stretch for 4. Maybe if I carved it razor thin. The vegetables barely enough. My hands shook as I reached for extra plates, each one clattering like a reminder that nothing was going according to plan. "Need any help in there?" Dad, Agnes called sweetly from the living room. "No, no." I lied, the word automatic, brittle. "Everything's under control." But nothing was under control. My carefully orchestrated lunch had been hijacked, transformed into an ambush masquerading as a celebration. My words, my moment, my dignity, all of it stolen before I even had a chance to begin. Through the kitchen doorway, I watched as Eldon rose, prowling like he owned the air. His hands trailed along my bookshelf, pausing to pull a volume free, reading the spine as if he were an appraiser examining goods at auction. He even shifted my lamp, my favorite lamp, moving it from its place beside the armchair to the window table, claiming the prime spot as though rearranging my home were his right. Lula filled the silence with forced chatter, her voice too bright, too rehearsed. Have they finished that construction on Maple Street? It was such a mess when I drove through. When she drove through. Past tense. This was not her neighborhood anymore. This was not her home. And yet here she was sitting in my living room, making small talk, while Eldon took stock of the life I had managed to preserve from the ruin she'd left behind. And I stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching a carving knife like it was the only anchor keeping me from vanishing. I carried the drinks into the living room on a tray that rattled faintly in my hands, betraying the storm building inside me. Eldon had already taken possession of the space as though it were his own, his legs stretched casually across my coffee table. One hand wrapped lazily around the television remote, though he hadn't even bothered to turn it on. The air of entitlement clung to him like a tailored suit. "This turkey smells wonderful," Lula remarked, her tone polite but distant. She accepted her glass with careful fingers, her touch deliberately avoiding mine. Even after all these years, she could still wound me with something as simple as restraint. Agnes flitted between her mother and Eldon like a diplomat juggling rival nations, smiling too brightly, smoothing every silence before it became uncomfortable. She wanted harmony, a picture of unity, and she was succeeding. Everyone seemed content. Everyone, that is, except the man who had cooked the meal and opened his door. "The dining room's just through here," I announced, forcing a host's smile, my arm sweeping toward the doorway. "Everything should be ready." They filed past me in a line that felt more like a procession than a family gathering. As Agnes passed, she paused, squeezing my arm with a daughter's affection. "Thank you for being so gracious about this, Dad. I know surprises aren't really your thing, but I thought it would be wonderful to have everyone together." Wonderful for whom I wanted to ask, but her eyes glowed with such innocent satisfaction that the words died in my throat. All I could do was nod and follow my uninvited guests toward what had become, against my will, the most important meal of my life. The dining room, which I had set so carefully for two, now looked pitifully unprepared for four. My best china, meant to honor a private moment with my daughter, suddenly seemed cheap and inadequate under the weight of these extra eyes. I scrambled to add two more place settings, the clink of plates loud against the suffocating silence. They arranged themselves without waiting for direction. Eldon slid confidently into the head of the table, my chair claiming it with the ease of a man accustomed to taking what wasn't his. Agnes sat beside him, leaning naturally toward his orbit as if pulled by gravity. Lula lowered herself delicately into the chair opposite, her purse still perched in her lap like a shield. That left me with the last remaining seat at the foot of my own table. The hierarchy had been established before we'd even said grace. Not that grace would be offered. I'd learned long ago that prayer wasn't welcome when it might unsettle Eldon. The weight in my chest grew unbearable. The walls pressed in my dining room, shrinking into something claustrophobic, an interrogation chamber, disguised as a holiday meal. I forced a smile, excused myself, and guided Agnes onto the back patio. The summer air was cooler than I expected, brushing against my skin like relief, though the tension clung just as heavily out here. Through the open kitchen window, I could hear Lula's voice drifting into the night, offering polite commentary about my flower beds. A moment later, Eldon's deeper tone joined hers, claiming expertise on landscaping decisions I had made with my own hands, my own sweat. He was already rewriting the story of this home, as though he'd been part of it all along. "Why did you bring them here, Agnes?" I asked, turning to her with a steadiness I didn't quite feel. She crossed her arms, that same old teenage gesture that once meant "you caught me," but I won't admit it. "Eldon wanted to see your house. Mom did too." This was supposed to be our day, I pressed, lowering my voice because sound carried easily through these small rooms. "Our time together." Her chin lifted, defiant the way it always had when she was convinced she knew better. "3 hours, remember? That's all you said you could spare. I thought this would be better, more meaningful, like a real family gathering instead of just obligation." Obligation. The word sliced through me, bitter and sharp, hanging between us like smoke. I turned away, walking deeper into the garden, past the roses I had planted the year she left for college, past the stone path I'd laid with my own hands 5 summers ago. Agnes followed her heels, striking the stones in a rhythm that sounded more like accusation than accompaniment. "You planned this," I said finally, not as a question, but as the truth it was. The surprise bringing them both. This wasn't spontaneous. Her silence told me everything. She fiddled with her earring, that same nervous habit she'd had since she was a little girl, back when her biggest worries were scraped knees or forgotten homework. Seeing it now in this context pierced me. "Eldon thought it would be good for everyone to spend time together," she said at last, voice wrapped in the kind of practiced optimism that sounds rehearsed. "You know, blended family bonding." Blended family. The phrase landed like a stone in my chest, grinding away at the fragile thread that still tethered me to my daughter. Blended meant smoothed over, diluted my singular role in her life, reduced to just one ingredient in a mixture I'd never agreed to. My throat tightened. "And what exactly did you tell them about our conversation yesterday?" I asked carefully. "About your business plans." She hesitated, darting a quick glance back toward the house, as if afraid someone might be watching. "Nothing yet," she admitted, lowering her voice. "I wanted today to go well first. You know how Mom gets about business talk?" For the briefest moment, relief surged through me. If she hadn't told them about the money yet, I still had time. But almost instantly, dread took its place. That meant the conversation was still waiting for me, waiting to unfold in front of an audience that would dissect every word, every hesitation. "Agnes," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, about what we discussed yesterday. "We can talk about that later, Dad." She cut me off gently, though her eyes carried a warning. "Right now, I just want everyone to get along." Her wrist flicked casually as she checked her watch, an elegant, expensive thing I didn't recognize. Another gift from him, no doubt. Besides, she added, "there's plenty of time to work out the details." Work out the details. She spoke as though the very real threat of my financial ruin was a scheduling inconvenience, no more pressing than a dentist appointment. From inside, a burst of laughter spilled through the open window. Eldon's laughter, deep and self-assured, the kind that demanded attention. The sound carried like smoke curling into the garden, uninvited and unavoidable. Agnes's lips curved into a reflexive smile at the sound, and it twisted something inside me. "He's really trying, you know," she said softly. "This isn't easy for him, either. Coming to—" She paused, fumbling for the right phrasing. "Coming to your house." "His," what I pressed. She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't wound. "His, wife's ex-husband's house." The pause said more than the words themselves ever could. Territory. He saw this as territory, land he had already conquered, yet still felt the need to occupy fully. "I appreciate the effort," I lied, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "But maybe next time a little warning would be—" "There won't be a next time if today goes badly." Her tone sharpened suddenly, cutting through the pretense. She crossed her arms, a mirror of the defiant teenager I used to argue with years ago. "I'm trying to build something here, Dad. Something that works for everyone. But that requires flexibility from all parties." All parties? I was no longer father, no longer anchor, no longer essential. I was a party, another name on the guest list of my own life. "I thought you'd be happy," she continued, her voice softening again as she leaned into her own justification. "Happy to have your whole family here for Father's Day. Isn't that what fathers want, to be surrounded by people who love them? People who love them." And in her mind, that list now included Eldon, sitting smugly in my chair, touching my books, mapping out the contours of my life, as though he had the right. Through the kitchen window, I saw him again, opening cabinets, peering inside like a buyer touring a property before making an offer. Lula hovered nearby, fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to stop him. He was cataloging my home, my belongings, my history with the precision of a general planning an occupation. "Your phone's buzzing," Agnes said suddenly, nodding toward my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a spam call or some neighborhood alert, but the screen showed 3 missed calls from Jerry, my colleague, the only person who'd offered a real lifeline with the loans. My pulse spiked. Whatever Jerry had to say, it could mean everything. "I should take this," I muttered, but Agnes was already heading back toward the house, her voice bright again, rehearsed. Don't be long, Dad. Lunch is getting cold and Eldon hates cold food. Eldon hates cold food. In my house, even my table now bent itself around his preferences. My throat burned, but I followed her back toward the door, the phone heavy in my pocket like an anchor I couldn't lift. Just before stepping inside, Agnes turned once more, her face serious. I really hope this works out, Dad. For everyone's sake. The warning was unmistakable sharp beneath her words. Sometimes you just have to adapt to new family dynamics. That's how life evolves. Life evolves. The phrase lingered bitterly like medicine forced down your throat, leaving behind only the aftertaste of surrender. My place in this gathering had shifted, no longer the father at the center of my daughter's world, but a supporting character in a family drama where new roles had already been cast and rehearsed without me. The voices drifting from inside grew louder as we reached the back door. Eldon was in full command, his voice resonant and certain, the sound of a man who never questioned whether others would listen. Lula chimed in at the right moments, her laughter light, but practiced like an actress delivering lines in a play she'd been given only yesterday. I stood outside for a beat longer than necessary, bracing myself. I knew stepping through that door meant stepping further into the background of my own life. Agnes didn't hesitate. She pushed the back door open with a brightness that felt rehearsed, her voice carrying into the room. Lunch is ready, everyone. Her tone was cheerful, confident, as though this were her home now and not mine. I followed her in slower, noticing how naturally she moved into the role of co-host, guiding, smoothing, arranging, all without asking, all without needing permission. Eldon rose from where he'd been examining my spice rack, looking as though he'd been inspecting inventory he might one day own. Lula, caught in the act of studying an old photograph of Agnes's graduation, set it down gently on the counter. Her expression was unreadable, but I could feel her judgment lingering in the air like perfume. The dining room seemed to shrink as the four of us filed in. I'd added 2 more place settings in a hurry, but the mismatched chairs and the cramped fit made the table look awkward, inadequate, like a boy trying on his father's oversized suit. My careful setting for 2 had been stretched thin, exposing the reality of my solitary life. Eldon didn't ask where to sit. He simply claimed the head of the table, my seat, with the confidence of someone who had never known denial. Agnes slipped in beside him, leaning toward his gravity as naturally as a compass needle finds north. Lula sat opposite her, leaving me the only remaining chair at the foot of my own table. The hierarchy was unmistakable. It had been established without a word, and I had been relegated before we'd even begun. "This looks delicious," Winfred, Lula offered brightly, her voice tinged with forced enthusiasm. "You always did know your way around a turkey." Eldon carved into his portion with clinical precision. "Turkey's a bit dry," he observed, not cruelly but dismissively, as though he were grading a student's effort. "Not bad for home cooking, though. Most people overcook it. Easy mistake without proper equipment." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I've managed fine. Got used to it over the past 5 years." The words came out more defensive than I'd intended, and Agnes shot me a look, a warning disguised as a daughter's glance. Her fork sliced neatly through the meat, her movements measured and precise. She didn't speak in my defense. Eldon, meanwhile, continued with casual authority, his gaze sweeping the room like an assessor calculating value. "Curious how you manage such a big house alone. Must be quite the challenge maintenance-wise." I gripped the serving spoon tighter than necessary, my knuckles pale. "The house isn't that big," I said, carefully spooning cranberry sauce onto my plate. "Just right for one person." Still, Eldon countered, gesturing vaguely toward the crown molding and ceiling, his eyes already measuring the square footage. "All those rooms to heat and winter property taxes on a place this size. Economic efficiency would suggest something more compact." Agnes laughed, the sound quick and brittle in the confined space. "Eldon's always thinking about optimization. It's what makes him so successful in business." Successful in business. The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. A contrast left unspoken, but loud enough. Successful in business, unlike her father. Lula, perhaps sensing the tension, tried to soften the air with her own brand of cheer. The neighborhood's really maintained its character, though. Those oak trees must be at least 60 years old. Mature landscaping does add value. Eldon agreed, nodding as though she'd passed a test. Then his eyes flicked toward me again, sharp, clinical. Though I noticed the gutters could use some attention. And that front step, quite a crack developing. His words weren't just observations. They were subtle claims planting flags in territory that was still mine. Every word from Eldon wasn't just casual conversation. It was a blade sharp and deliberate, placed with precision. Each remark cut deeper, not about the turkey, not about the wine, but about me, about the man who had once stood strong in this very house, who now looked more and more like someone slipping into irrelevance. My home, the place I had built, repaired, and filled with memories, was being reduced to an exhibit of failure. To them, the cracked step was not a simple crack, it was proof of my decline. The gutters were not just neglected, they were evidence that I could no longer carry the weight of ownership. I kept my head low, focused on carving more turkey, though the knife grew heavier in my hand with every slice. The meal I had prepared with such care, marinated, seasoned, basted with love, was being eaten as though it were inventory, a checklist against my inadequacies. Dad always makes the best holiday meals, Agnes said suddenly, her voice warm, but thin, as though she knew she had to defend me, but no longer fully believed in the words. Remember that Christmas stuffing, Mom, with the chestnuts? Lula's face softened instantly, seizing the chance to rescue me. That was wonderful, she said quickly, smiling toward me. You always put so much thought into the details. Details. That word landed with a bittersweet weight. Details matter, Eldon interjected, not missing his chance. He reached across me without asking and took the salt, though sometimes it's more efficient to delegate. Professional catering, for example, saves time for more important things. More important things. The implication was so clear it was cruel. What could be more important than a father cooking for his daughter on Father's Day? The message hovered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Agnes looked down at her phone, a quick glance, before lifting her eyes with a satisfied smile. This is exactly what I wanted. All my parents together sharing a meal. All her parents. The phrase stung worse than any of Eldon's cuts. I was no longer the father, no longer the center of her life. I was just one member of a committee stripped of significance, my role diluted by the presence of the man now sitting at my table, my chair. Wine would complement this nicely, Eldon remarked, swirling the water in his glass as though it were beneath him. Perhaps a nice Pinot Noir. We have an excellent bottle we brought back from Soma. We, the shared pronoun of possession, the casual display of wealth, the reminder that he had given her a world of experiences I no longer could. I'm not much of a wine drinker, I admitted quietly, though I remembered well how much I used to enjoy it. Back when a good bottle was part of celebration, not an impossible expense. Shame, Eldon said, lips curving into a smile with no warmth. Good wine education opens doors. Business dinners, client entertainment, social connections. Essential in today's market. Today's market. The phrase was not directed at me, but it buried me all the same. It was a reminder that my time, my relevance, belonged to yesterday. Men like me didn't fit in anymore. The conversation carried on without me, through me, sometimes brushing against me like a courtesy to an old relic. Agnes spoke with bright animation eyes alive as she shared her work, her plans, her dreams. Her future seemed buoyed by the very people who quietly dismissed my existence. When dessert was mentioned, I offered the coffee and the store-bought pie I had hidden in the freezer. It was all I could afford, and I prayed they wouldn't see it as yet another shortcoming. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Jerry's third call. Urgent, no doubt. But how could I leave now, abandon my seat when the battlefield required me to stay? Coffee sounds perfect, Agnes declared, already rising with quick, efficient movements. Dad, you sit. Mom and I will take care of the cleanup. Even the cleanup, even that small role was taken from me. I sat alone at the foot of my own table, watching Eldon lean back in my chair, his hand draped across the armrest with the satisfaction of a man who had already claimed victory. I knew then that the moment was coming. Very soon Agnes would bring up the money. And when that happened, I would be stripped bare, forced to reveal my failure in front of the man who had already replaced me in every other way that mattered. Empty coffee cups circled the table. Agnes glanced at her watch, her lips curving into a satisfied smile. We should stay a bit longer, she said, settling back into her seat beside Eldon. Make this a real family afternoon. The way she looked at him, that silent exchange, sent a cold weight sinking into my chest. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't about family. This was planned, orchestrated, and then Eldon moved. With theatrical precision, he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers curling around something hidden. The way his lips curved into a smile made my blood run cold. Something was coming. The movement carried the weight of ceremony, deliberate and theatrical, like a magician drawing out the moment before his final dazzling trick. Eldon's hand dipped into his jacket with practiced confidence, and his smile spread slowly, savoring the suspense he himself had created. Actually, Agnes, he began, his voice smooth and commanding, before we get too comfortable. With a flourish worthy of a game show host, he withdrew a folded piece of paper and placed it carefully on my table right beside the faint brown ring of an old coffee stain that was slowly bleeding deeper into the wood. The crisp snap of the paper being unfolded seemed to echo in the air louder than it should have been, like the sound of a verdict being read aloud in court. Even from where I sat upside down, the number was unmistakable, clear, bold, confident, written in the assured hand of a man accustomed to signing away fortunes. $100, $1,000. Agnes Eldon said, sliding the check toward her with the casual generosity of a king bestowing alms. Here's $100,000 for your startup. The words detonated in the room. Agnes gasped, her hands flying instinctively to her mouth. The surprise was real. Her wide eyes and trembling breath told me she hadn't been in on this performance. For once, she wasn't part of his script. Eldon won. I can't believe this. She stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of gratitude and shock. She shot out of her chair as though propelled by sheer joy, and in the next moment her arms were flung around his neck. She pressed her face into his shoulder, her entire body vibrating with gratitude and affection. Her words, muffled but clear, sliced through me like a knife. Thank you, Dad. You're such a real father. A real father. The phrase landed harder than any physical blow could have. My chest tightened. My breath caught, and in that instant it was as if the walls of my house closed in on me. I stared at the check lying on the table, stark, undeniable, humiliating, and all I could see in its bold digits was the shadow of my own inadequacy. My savings flashed through my mind in cruel, mocking neon, $25,000. That was the fruit of 5 long years of careful budgeting, skipped indulgences, quiet sacrifices no one ever saw. It was the sum total of everything I had been able to give. I have $25,000 in savings, I blurted, my voice breaking under the strain. The words came out small, pathetic, desperate, yet I couldn't stop them. I needed her to understand that I had tried. The room fell silent, heavy, and suffocating. Agnes turned toward me, her joy collapsing into something darker, something sharper. Her expression hardened as though years of buried disappointment had finally found their escape. Her eyes locked onto mine, merciless and burning. 25,000, she repeated, her lips curling. Then she laughed, a short, brittle laugh with no joy, no warmth. That's it. That's what 33 years of fatherhood amounts to. I tried to explain, to tell her about the banks I'd approached, the friends I'd called, the antiques I'd considered selling. The words tripped over themselves, clumsy, insufficient, dying in the air between us. But she was already moving toward me. You never loved me, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. All these years I thought you cared, but you can't even do what Eldon does without thinking twice. Agnes, sweetheart, that's not Eldon is my real father, she snapped, cutting me down with surgical precision. He proves it every single day while you just sit here in this sad little house counting pennies. The slap came without warning. Her hand moved so quickly I barely registered it until the sharp crack echoed through my dining room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. A hot sting spread across my cheek, and I tasted the metallic tang of blood where my tooth had cut my lip. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the old house seemed to hold its breath. Lula gasped, her trembling hand covering her mouth, her wide eyes fixed on her daughter as if she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. Eldon sat frozen, his confident mask faltering for the first time. His little show of dominance had spiraled into something raw and violent, something he hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted to expose. Agnes stood over me, her chest heaving with righteous fury, her hands still tingling from the force of the blow. She looked down at me as though she had finally uncovered the truth she had always suspected, that I was small, that I was weak, that I was unworthy of the title of father. I didn't move. I remained seated at the foot of my own table, my cheek burning blood in my mouth and the overturned coffee cup spreading a fresh stain across the tablecloth. The bitter liquid seeped slowly outward, just as the truth of my defeat spread through the room, undeniable, irreversible. Such a small, almost absurd detail to notice in a moment that split my life in two. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the napkin, moving slowly, deliberately, as though the act itself carried the weight of ritual. I pressed the soft white fabric to my lip, feeling the sting as it touched the cut. When I pulled it away, the napkin bore a bright smear of red proof, not just of the slap, but of something far deeper. Proof of my daughter's final rejection. That crimson mark carried the death of 33 years. 33 years of bedtime stories whispered in the dark to chase away her fears. 33 years of scraped knees bandaged with trembling but steady hands. 33 years of standing tall at school, plays, graduations, and birthdays. My heart swelling with pride at every milestone. All of it dismissed, erased, undone, with one violent gesture that rang louder than words ever could. Yet as I sat there tasting iron and feeling the heat radiate across my cheek, something inside me began to shift. The blow had been meant to end me, to cement my irrelevance once and for all, to prove that I was no longer a father, but a useless remnant of a role already filled. But instead it stripped away the last fragile restraint I had been clinging to. And with its absence came something unexpected: freedom. I rose slowly, not in haste, but with deliberate strength, letting every inch of my height reclaim its rightful place. My body ached, my face burned, but my presence filled the room again. Agnes stood before me, chest heaving, her eyes ablaze with triumphant rage, still convinced that she had destroyed me. Eldon sat stiffly in my chair, the throne he had stolen, watching with unease. His satisfaction wavered like a candle flickering in a draft he hadn't anticipated. Lula, poor Lula, stared at her daughter as if she were meeting a stranger. For the first time, her eyes clouded with horror. On the table, the check lay forgotten. The crisp paper, the neat row of zeros, it all seemed so laughably small, now meaningless in the shadow of what I carried inside me. I held something Eldon could never buy, something far more valuable than wealth or prestige. I held the truth. And truth, once spoken, would reshape everything Agnes thought she knew about love, loyalty, and what it truly meant to be a father. With slow precision, I wiped the last trace of blood from my lip. Every gesture was deliberate, calculated, a reclamation of dignity stolen with that slap. The dining room felt suspended in time, each breath heavy, each silence deafening. Finally, I turned my eyes to Agnes. My voice, though carrying the metallic tang of blood, rang steady, an iron bell breaking through the tension. "You're right, Agnes. I'm not your real father." The words exploded in the room, reverberating like a bomb. Agnes's triumphant expression faltered, confusion spreading across her features, choking her fury. What? What do you mean?" Her voice, sharp with disbelief, cracked under the weight of uncertainty. I let the silence stretch, let the moment breathe, while I watched her rage transform into fear. Slowly, the truth began to seep into her eyes. 33 years of deception, I said quietly, each word carrying decades of buried weight. And it's about to end tonight. We took you from the orphanage when you were just 2 years old. Her face went white, drained of blood in an instant. The same hand that had struck me trembled now, rising weakly to her chest, as though to protect a heart that suddenly felt exposed. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice breaking apart like shattered glass. "You're lying. You're just trying to punish me. Mom, tell him. Tell me he's lying." But Lula's tears had already fallen, sliding down her cheeks in silent confession. She shook her head, her voice trembling, but unshakable in its truth. "It's true, sweetheart. We wanted to tell you. We thought about it so many times, but the years slipped by, and it never seemed like the right moment. We told ourselves we were protecting you. We told ourselves you weren't ready. But the truth never went away." Agnes's legs buckled. She staggered back, her hand flailing for the chair she'd abandoned earlier, but she missed. Her body hit the wall with a dull thud, the sound echoing through the small dining room. 2 years old, she whispered, barely audible, as though saying the words could make them vanish. "I've been living my whole life, and I never knew." I took a breath, my voice steady, my engineer's precision guiding me even now. "Your birth parents couldn't care for you. Social services placed you with us. And from the very first moment we saw you, we loved you. You were ours. You will always be ours. No check, no money. No man can take that truth away. And in that instant, as my words hung in the heavy air, I knew the balance in the room had shifted forever. Scared so very small, clinging to a tattered, stuffed rabbit whose fur had been worn thin by too many sleepless nights. That's how I first saw you, Agnes. That memory has never left me. It's etched into my heart as vividly now as it was 3 decades ago. Eldon's smug mask had shattered completely by now. The man who had strutted in with confidence and money sat frozen in my chair, realizing too late that he'd stepped into a bond forged of choices, not biology. He finally understood this wasn't a simple game of wealth and power. It was a family history written in quiet sacrifices and unconditional love. For 33 years, I said, my voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word, I have been your father. Not by blood, not by accident, by choice. I felt the words burn through the silence, heavier than any check Eldon could ever write. Every nightmare that woke you in the dead of night, I was the one who came to your side. Every scraped knee I patched, every school performance I clapped for, until my hands hurt every proud tear I shed when you achieved something you never thought possible. None of it was demanded of me by nature. I did it because I chose to, because I wanted you. Agnes's back slid slowly against the wall until she crumpled onto the dining room floor. Her silk blouse wrinkled, her makeup smudged by falling tears, her expensive hairstyle unraveling with each trembling sob. The woman who had just struck me, who had declared another man her real father, now looked like a lost child again. Her voice was barely audible, fragile and cracked. You chose me. Every single day I lowered myself to one knee beside her, ignoring the ache that flared in my aging joints. I reached toward her, as I had so many times before, when she was small enough to crawl into my arms for comfort. Yes, I whispered. When you were 5, terrified of monsters beneath your bed. When you were 16, heartbroken because Tommy Morrison didn't see you the way you wished he would. When you graduated and called me in tears of joy because your dreams were finally within reach. Every single day, Agnes, I chose to be your father, and I would choose it again, 1,000 times over. She lifted her face, streaked with tears, but her words trembled with doubt. But Eldon, he gave me money. Money. I gestured toward the forgotten check on the table, the inked numbers screaming their emptiness in the heavy air. He gave you paper. I gave you a life, a name, a home, a family, an identity that no bank account can buy. I gave you 33 years of devotion, not because I had to, but because I loved you. Lula's voice broke behind me, soft but filled with raw truth. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. We almost told you so many times, sweetheart, after the divorce especially, but you were already hurting, already trying to adjust, and we couldn't bring ourselves to add more pain. We thought we were protecting you. Eldon, finally shaken free from his silence, tried to interject. I didn't know. She never told me. Of course she didn't, I replied, my voice calm now, almost tender. Because she didn't know. No one outside this family ever did except the lawyers and the social workers. And they swore confidentiality. To the world, you were always our daughter. Because you were. Agnes's hand lifted hesitantly, trembling, as she reached for the bright red mark her slap had left on my cheek. Her voice cracked. You let me hit you. You let me call you a failure. Tell you you weren't my real father. I covered her hand, gently pressing it against my skin. Because I wanted you to see with your own eyes the difference between a man who buys loyalty and a man who gives love freely. Eldon became your mother's husband, and by default, he became a figure in your life. But I chose you before I ever laid eyes on you. I said yes to a child who needed a family sight, unseen, without conditions. That's what makes me your father. The air conditioning stirred the forgotten check on the table, its paper rustling absurdly loud in the silence. Compared to the truth now laid bare, those numbers were nothing more than meaningless ink. Agnes stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Through her tears, I could see recognition dawning, finally understanding the weight of what it meant to be loved, not out of obligation, but by deliberate choice. Her voice broke into a whisper, more confession than statement. I struck the man who saved me from an orphanage. The realization shattered her completely. Her sobs shook her shoulders as she buried her face in her hands. I stayed by her side, not moving, not speaking, letting her weep out 33 years of misunderstanding. Lula hovered nearby, torn between the instinct to cradle her daughter and the fear that too much touch would make the wound deeper. Even Eldon, once so sure of his superiority, sat hollowed out, stripped of all his smugness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Agnes lifted her tear-stained face to mine. Her words were raw, childlike in their vulnerability. All those years, you never told me I wasn't your blood, but you loved me anyway. I smiled faintly, brushing away the last of her tears with my thumb. My voice was steady, filled with the truth I'd carried for so long. You were never not my blood, Agnes. You became my blood the moment I signed those adoption papers. You became my daughter the moment I chose you. And nothing, no check, no slap, no cruel words will ever change that. Biology is only the beginning, I said softly, my voice steady, though my heart trembled with all the years that had led to this moment. It's love that makes us family. Agnes's breath caught her body trembling, as though the weight of every revelation had finally settled upon her shoulders. Slowly, unsteadily, she struggled to her knees. Her hand lifted, hesitant, almost afraid, until her fingertips brushed against the red mark her slap had left across my cheek. Her touch lingered, fragile and shaking. Her voice cracked like glass. Oh my God, what have I done? Forgive me, Dad. The word dad had never sounded like this before. No longer careless, no longer thrown out with frustration or indifference. This time it was laced with awe, humility, and an aching need for forgiveness. It carried the weight of truth. Tears gathered in her eyes as she went on, her words spilling out between uneven breaths. You loved me even when you didn't know I wasn't your blood. You chose me when my real parents couldn't. You saved me from whatever nightmare would have swallowed me if I'd stayed in that system. You gave me everything. I bent down, my knees creaking under the effort, but for once I didn't feel old. My arms steadied her as I lifted her up, my body aching but my spirit lighter than it had been in decades. You've always been my daughter, Agnes, I whispered. Always. And then she collapsed into me, arms tightening with a desperate, almost feral intensity, the embrace of someone who had just realized how close they'd come to losing the most precious bond of their life. Her sobs soaked through my shirt as her words tumbled out against my chest. I'm so sorry. Sorry for comparing you to him. Sorry for thinking money meant love. Sorry for forgetting who you are, what you've given me. Over her trembling shoulder, I caught sight of Eldon, still rooted to my chair, like a man who had stumbled into a play far bigger than he was prepared for. His smugness had dissolved, leaving only silence. The check, his mighty weapon, still lay untouched on the table, but it meant nothing now. Forgotten. Useless. All his wealth, all his swagger, all his shallow promises could not touch the bond forged by 3 decades of chosen love. Agnes's voice broke again, muffled against me. Can you forgive me for hitting you, for those cruel words, for not seeing what you really gave me? I smoothed her hair just as I had countless nights when she was small, frightened and seeking comfort. My voice was quiet but sure. There's nothing to forgive. You're my daughter. And being your father means loving you even when you forget who we are to each other. Lula stepped closer, her tears slowing, but her eyes shining with both grief and relief. Her voice was gentle, fragile. We should have told you years ago. We were afraid it would change how you saw us, how you saw yourself. Agnes pulled back, her face raw with tears as she looked between us. She shook her head slowly, whispering, as though the words were still forming inside her. It does change things, but not the way you think. It makes everything bigger, more meaningful. You didn't have to love me, but you did. You chose me every day. That's worth more than blood. Her gaze shifted then toward Eldon, who was staring at the tablecloth, as though it held all the answers he'd never thought to ask. His discomfort was palpable. His earlier bravado stripped away. Agnes's voice was soft but firm. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I asked you both for money without understanding what I was really asking, without realizing what I already had. Eldon swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I didn't know. Agnes never mentioned. Because she didn't know, I cut in gently. No one outside this family did. To the world, she was our daughter, our blood. And in every way that matters, she always has been. The check fluttered slightly in the air conditioning, its rustling absurdly loud in the quiet room. All of Eldon's money, all his attempts at superiority, meant nothing now. Agnes turned back to me, her eyes brighter through the tears filled with something new, something that looked very much like understanding. She nodded toward the forgotten paper. The check, it's still yours if you want it, for the business. But then she shook her head, her voice steadier this time. No, I don't think I need it anymore. Not like that. Maybe it's time I start smaller. Build something myself instead of always looking for shortcuts. For the first time in years, I felt pride swell in my chest. Not the desperate pride of a man struggling to prove himself, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of a father watching his daughter take her first true step toward becoming the woman she was meant to be. Your father would be proud of that decision, Lula said softly. For the first time in 5 long years, I knew without doubt that she was speaking about me. The words carried no hesitation, no hidden edge, only truth. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been clenched and guarded for decades, finally began to loosen. The afternoon light had shifted by then, filtering through the curtains and casting long golden shadows across the dining room. The same room where anger had boiled over, where harsh words had cut deeper than knives, where old wounds had been ripped open. But it was also the room where forgiveness had taken root, fragile yet real, where the pieces of a broken family had begun to fit together again. My eyes drifted to the tablecloth. The dark splash of coffee stained it forever, impossible to wash away. And yet I realized I didn't want to. That stain would remain a permanent reminder of the day my daughter finally saw me for who I was, and the day I finally heard her call me Dad with the weight of truth behind the word. Agnes stepped back from our embrace, though her fingers clung to mine, as if she feared letting go would break what we had just mended. Her eyes were red but steady, her voice low and trembling with sincerity. I know this doesn't fix everything. I have 33 years of taking your love for granted to make up for. I squeezed her hand, my voice firm but gentle. We have time. That's what family gives us, time. Time to get it wrong and time to try again. Across the table, Eldon shifted uncomfortably, his polished confidence stripped away in this unfamiliar terrain of raw emotion. Clearing his throat, he murmured, "Perhaps we should head home. Give you two some space." Agnes turned to him, and to my quiet surprise, there was no bitterness in her expression. Instead, she offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for wanting to help with the business, and for showing me what I was really looking for in a father. I already had it. I just didn't see it until now." The words hung in the air, heavy and luminous, all at once. Eldon nodded stiffly, clearly, unsure of how to respond. For once, his money, his presence, his pride, all of it seemed small, insignificant. As they gathered their things, Agnes turned back to me one last time. She threw her arms around me again, holding me longer this time, without the frantic desperation of before. It was steadier now, deeper, filled with certainty. When she whispered into my ear, her voice cracked, but her words struck straight into my soul. "Happy Father's Day, Dad, my real father." When the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not empty, not abandoned, but filled with a quiet peace that I hadn't known in years. The silence was no longer heavy, it was comforting. I moved slowly through the room, gathering the dishes, wiping down the table. My hand lingered over the coffee stain, and instead of frustration, I felt gratitude. That stain wasn't a blemish anymore. It was a marker. The moment my daughter found her way back to me, the check still lay where Eldon had left it, but when I looked at it now, it seemed smaller. Insignificant. Paper could not measure the wealth I had gained that day. Tomorrow Agnes would call, and we would begin the long, patient work of rebuilding all that we had nearly lost. But tonight I would sit in my chair, and hold on to the memory of her arms around me, the weight of her head against my shoulder, and the sound of her voice calling me Dad with new understanding of what that word truly meant. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.